What if I told you that the elaborate hairstyles worn by wealthy Victorian women were not symbols of pristine elegance, but crawling ecosystems of lice, mites, and decay? Behind the carefully constructed image of moral purity and refined cleanliness lay a grotesque reality that polite society desperately concealed beneath layers of pomade, powder, and denial. The towering coiffures and intricate hair arrangements that we associate with Victorian refinement were, in truth, breeding grounds for parasites, monuments to the disturbing lengths people would endure to maintain appearances in a society obsessed with artificial perfection. We imagine the Victorian era through sepia-tinted photographs of stern-faced ladies with impossibly elaborate hairstyles, their hair piled high in architectural marvels that seem to defy gravity. In our romanticized vision, these women glide through gaslit ballrooms smelling of lavender and rosewater, their appearances as flawless as their moral character was supposed to be. But strip away the heavy perfumes and carefully applied powders, and you discover a reality far more disturbing than any Gothic novel of the era dared to describe. Chapter 1. The architecture of artificial beauty. The morning ritual in a wealthy Victorian household began before dawn in the servants' quarters, where the lady's maid prepared for what would become an hours-long construction project. The dressing room itself was a theater of transformation, thick with the mingled scents of burning hair from heated tongs, the cloying sweetness of heavy pomades made from animal fats, and the underlying sourness of bodies that bathed infrequently, and hair that was washed even less. The lady of the house sits before her mirror, embodying the archetype of the angel in the house, the moral center of Victorian domestic life. But right now, she is simply exhausted before her day has even begun. Her scalp already aches in anticipation of what is to come, the attachment of false hair pieces, switches, and padding that will transform her modest natural hair into the towering monument demanded by fashion. These were not the synthetic, washable extensions we know today. Victorian hair pieces were organic materials, human hair, yes, but also horsehair, wool, and sometimes hemp fiber. The construction was elaborate and permanent. Wire frames provided structure. Wool padding created volume. Animal-based pomades held everything in place while adding the glossy shine that signified wealth and status. Imagine the sensory experience as the maid works. The metallic scrape of hairpins against wireframes. The tug and pull as natural hair is teased and twisted around the artificial foundation. The weight sometimes several pounds settling onto the skull like a crown of lead. The immediate sensation of heat as the scalp, now covered by layers of organic material, begins to warm and sweat beneath its artificial canopy. The lady cannot simply wash this creation when it becomes dirty or uncomfortable. Water would destroy the carefully constructed shape, ruin the pomade that holds everything in place, and damage the expensive hair pieces that represent a significant investment. Instead, she must live with her architectural hairpiece for days or weeks at a time, adding powder to absorb oils, perfume to mask odors, and enduring whatever biological consequences emerge from this sealed, organic environment. What she has created, unknowingly, is the perfect incubator. Warm, humid, rich in organic matter, and undisturbed for long periods, it is an ecosystem waiting to be colonized. And the colonizers are already on their way, hitchhiking in the very materials from which her beautiful coiffure is constructed. The irony is profound, and will become our central theme in their desperate attempt to rise above nature, to prove their superiority over the animal kingdom through artificial enhancement. The Victorian elite created perfect habitats for the very creatures they considered beneath them. The higher the hair, the further from nature they believed themselves to be, but biology does not respect social pretensions. And the tiny inhabitants preparing to take residence in these elaborate constructions care nothing for titles, wealth, or moral superiority. As we watch the final pins slide into place and the lady admire her transformed reflection, we must ask, what else is reflected in that mirror? What invisible passengers have just been sealed into their new home? And what will happen when they wake up? Chapter 2. The Harvest, a Global Trade in Human Misery. To understand how Victorian hair became infested, we must follow the dark supply chain that fed the insatiable appetite for artificial beauty. The demand for human hair in 19th century Europe and America had reached extraordinary levels. Fashion magazines dictated styles requiring 2 or 3 times the amount of hair a normal human head could produce, creating a massive deficit that had to be filled from somewhere, or rather, from one. Enter our archetype of the hair merchant, a figure who appears in the historical record with disturbing regularity. He was a traveling trader who moved through the poorest regions of Europe, carrying packs of cheap trinkets and bright ribbons. His target was desperation itself, young peasant women whose long, untreated hair represented their only valuable asset in a world that offered them few economic opportunities. The transaction was brutally simple: a silk scarf for a lifetime of growth, a few coins for a braid that reached the waist. These women, often illiterate and facing starvation, were shorn like sheep, their hair bundled and sold into a supply chain they could never have imagined. This was the premium end of the trade hair that came from living heads, voluntarily surrendered. But there was never enough voluntary supply to meet the voracious demand. When a commodity is scarce and prices are high, markets inevitably turn to darker sources. Rumors began circulating in the salons of London and New York whispers that the beautiful switches adorning fashionable heads had not come from French peasant girls, but from far more disturbing origins. Hospital wards became hunting grounds. The sick and dying, their bodies unclaimed and their identities forgotten, provided a steady supply of hair that could be harvested without consent or compensation. Morgues and poorhouses offered similar opportunities. A woman might die of cholera in a charity hospital on Monday, and by Friday, her hair could be sitting in a wig shop window, cleaned just enough to remove visible dirt, but retaining everything invisible: the bacteria, the fungal spores, and the eggs of parasites that had made their home in her. Unwashed locks. The cleaning process was superficial at best. Victorian sanitization meant a wash in soapy water and perhaps a rinse in alcohol. But the eggs of lice nits are cemented to hair shafts with a substance stronger than most adhesives. They survive washing, survive storage, and wait patiently for the warmth of a new scalp to trigger their hatching. The hair trade also cut costs by mixing human hair with animal fibers. Horsehair was common, but coarse. Goat hair, yak hair, and even cow hair were blended in to create bulk and reduce expenses. Each animal source brought its own ecosystem of parasites, ticks, mites, and fleas that had evolved to live on livestock, but were perfectly capable of adapting to human hosts when the opportunity arose. Picture the journey. Hair cut from a dying woman in a Glasgow slum is bundled with horsehair from a knacker's yard and goat hair from a rural farm. The mixture is packed into bales and loaded onto ships where it sits in damp, rat-infested holds for weeks. Upon arrival in London, it is sorted by workers who pick through the tangled mass with their bare hands, separating usable hair from the debris. These workers, often children, are the first victims, their own scalps becoming infested as they handle the contaminated materials. The wig maker himself occupies an ambiguous position in this ecosystem. He is a skilled artisan, respected for his craft, yet he works daily with materials he knows to be questionable. He sees the dirt, smells the sourness, notices the movement in freshly delivered bundles. But economic necessity and social pressure create a conspiracy of silence. He will delicately suggest that a client might benefit from a refreshed hairpiece, but he will never directly acknowledge the crawling reality of what he is creating. The finished product arrives at the lady's dressing table in a silk-lined box, looking perfect under gaslight. The maid lifts it reverently, as if handling something sacred. Neither woman suspects that they are about to welcome a Trojan horse onto the mistress's head, a beautiful construction that carries within its depths the biological legacy of poverty, death, and neglect from across the globe. As the hairpiece settles into place and the final pins are adjusted, thousands of microscopic eggs begin to respond to the warmth of their new environment. In the darkness beneath layers of artificial hair, ancient biological programs activate. The invasion is about to begin, and the lady's perfectly constructed facade is about to become a battlefield. Chapter 3. The Invisible Invasion Biology Meets Vanity. The first inhabitants to establish themselves in the warm, humid environment of a Victorian coiffure were almost always Lice, specifically Pediculus humanus capitis, the human head louse. These tiny parasites, barely visible to the naked eye, had evolved over millions of years to live in human hair, and the elaborate Victorian hairstyle represented paradise from their perspective. A female louse can lay up to 10 eggs per day, cementing each one to a hair shaft near the scalp, where warmth will ensure proper development. The eggs, called nits, are translucent and nearly impossible to see among the complex layers of natural and artificial hair. Within 7 to 10 days, the eggs hatch, releasing tiny nymphs that immediately begin feeding on blood from the scalp. The sensation begins subtly, a slight tingling behind the ear, a faint itch at the nape of the neck. But Victorian etiquette demanded that a lady never scratch in public, never touch her hair unnecessarily, never acknowledge physical discomfort. So she sits perfectly still during tea parties and dinner conversations, feeling the crawling sensation intensify as the louse population establishes itself and begins to multiply. The structure of Victorian hairstyles made the problem exponentially worse. The rat's mesh pads stuffed with hair used to create volume created perfect hiding places where lice could breed undisturbed. The layers of pomade, made from animal fats, provided additional food sources and created sticky surfaces where eggs could adhere more securely. The infrequent washing meant that populations could grow for weeks without disruption. But lice were only the beginning. The organic materials used in hair construction attracted other creatures. Clothes moths, drawn by the animal fibers, would lay their eggs in horsehair padding. The larvae that hatched would feed on the hair itself, creating bare patches and weakening the structure of the hairpiece. Carpet beetles, attracted by the keratin in human hair, would burrow into the construction, leaving behind shed skins and waste products that caused allergic reactions. More disturbing were the fungal infections that thrived in the warm, moist environment beneath elaborate hairstyles. Ringworm, despite its name, actually a fungus rather than a parasite, found ideal conditions in unwashed scalps covered by layers of organic matter. The infection caused intense itching, scaling, and hair loss, but Victorian medicine often misdiagnosed it as a nervous condition or hysterical scratching. The treatments were worse than the disease. Mercury-based ointments were applied directly to infected scalps, causing tooth loss, gum bleeding, and neurological damage. Arsenic powders were dusted into hair to purify it, creating clouds of toxic dust that poisoned not only the wearer, but everyone in her vicinity. Benzene and other volatile solvents were used to dry clean hair pieces, creating fire hazards that occasionally resulted in women literally bursting into flames when they sat too close to gas lamps or fireplaces. The sensory reality of living with an infested hairpiece was a constant low-level torture. The weight pressing down on the skull caused persistent headaches. The inability to scratch created a maddening psychological tension. The awareness that one's head was crawling with life, but the social impossibility of acknowledging it, created a form of cognitive dissonance that must have been nearly unbearable. Some women developed elaborate coping mechanisms. Ivory or silver scratching sticks long, slender rods tipped with tiny claws were discreetly inserted into hairstyles during social gatherings. A lady might smile and nod during dinner conversation while secretly manipulating one of these tools through her hair, seeking momentary relief from the burning itch that never fully subsided. The psychological toll was immense. Women began to doubt their own perceptions, especially when doctors dismissed their complaints as hysteria. The crawling sensation was real, but invisible to outside observers. The smell of rancid pomade was genuine, but masked by heavy perfumes. The constant discomfort was undeniable, but socially unacknowledgeable. This gaslighting, though the term did not yet exist, drove some women to genuine psychological distress. The servants knew the truth. The lady's maid, our crucial archetype, was the keeper of secrets that could destroy her mistress's reputation. She was the one who applied the mercury treatments by candlelight, who combed out the knits with fine-toothed combs, who discreetly shook contaminated brushes from windows. The crack of knits being crushed between thumbnails became a familiar sound in the quiet hours before dawn, a grotesque punctuation to the ritual of maintaining artificial beauty. This intimate knowledge created a strange power dynamic. One word from a disgruntled servant could expose the crawling reality beneath a lady's perfect facade. The threat of revelation bound mistress and maid together in a conspiracy of silence, each dependent on the other's discretion to maintain the elaborate fiction of cleanliness and refinement. As we move deeper into this story, we must confront the ultimate question. Why did they endure it? What psychological and social forces were so powerful that rational human beings would choose to live with infested scalps rather than abandon the fashions that caused their misery? Chapter 4. The Prison of Perfection Psychology and Social Control. To understand why Victorian women tolerated such extreme discomfort, we must examine the suffocating nature of 19th-century social expectations. This was an era when a woman's entire identity, social position, and economic security depended on maintaining an appearance of moral and physical purity. The consequences of being perceived as unclean were not merely embarrassing, they were socially and economically catastrophic. The Victorian concept of womanhood was built on the foundation of the separate spheres ideology. Women were believed to be naturally pure, moral, and refined, the angels who civilized men and maintained social order through their very presence. Any evidence of physical imperfection or biological reality threatened this carefully constructed mythology. To have lice was not simply to be uncomfortable, it was to be revealed as fundamentally animal, fundamentally human, fundamentally flawed. Consider the daily routine of our archetypal Victorian lady. She wakes each morning to the weight of social expectations that extends far beyond her personal comfort. Her appearance communicates not only her own status, but her family's position, her husband's success, and her children's prospects. Every curl must be perfectly placed, every ribbon properly tied, every surface polished to reflect the moral order she is supposed to embody. The elaborate morning ritual of hair construction becomes a form of armor building. As each pin slides into place and each artificial element is added, she is not simply getting dressed, she is preparing for battle. The battle to maintain the fiction of effortless perfection, to hide the sweat and struggle and biological reality that lies beneath the carefully constructed surface. But the armor is also a trap. Once the elaborate hairstyle is in place, she cannot remove it without admitting that it is artificial. She cannot wash it without destroying hours of work and expensive materials. She cannot acknowledge discomfort without revealing imperfection. She is literally trapped inside her own beauty, carrying the weight and the crawling reality for days or weeks at a time. The psychological mechanisms of denial become essential survival tools. The lady learns to reinterpret sensations, to dismiss the evidence of her own senses when it conflicts with social necessity. The crawling becomes imagination. The itching becomes nerves. The smell becomes sensitivity. This self-gaslighting is not weakness, it is adaptation to an impossible situation. The economic factors create additional pressure. A quality hairpiece represents a significant investment, sometimes equivalent to a servant's annual wages. For families on the margins of gentility, struggling to maintain appearances on limited resources, these artificial enhancements are both essential and ruinously expensive. Once purchased, they must be preserved and used as long as possible, regardless of their condition or the discomfort they cause. The social surveillance is constant and merciless. Other women watch for signs of imperfection, ready to spread gossip that could destroy reputations. Servants observe and judge, their own positions dependent on maintaining their employer's secrets. Even family members become potential threats. A husband's business prospects could be damaged by a wife's perceived uncleanliness. A daughter's marriage chances ruined by association with a mother who let herself go. The medical establishment reinforces these pressures by pathologizing women's complaints. When a lady reports crawling sensations or persistent itching, doctors trained in the emerging field of psychiatry are more likely to diagnose hysteria or nervous exhaustion than to investigate physical causes. The woman's own perceptions are dismissed as unreliable. Her discomfort attributed to mental weakness rather than biological reality. This medical gaslighting creates a vicious cycle. The woman begins to doubt her own senses, to question whether the crawling is real or imagined. The psychological stress of this uncertainty compounds the physical discomfort, creating genuine mental distress that doctors then point to as proof of their psychiatric diagnoses. The woman becomes trapped not only in her infested hairpiece, but in a medical system that refuses to acknowledge the reality of her experience. The servants who maintain these elaborate constructions occupy a unique position in this psychological ecosystem. The lady's maid, in particular, becomes both collaborator and potential threat. She knows the truth about the crawling, the smell, the constant discomfort. She applies the toxic treatments, removes the visible evidence of infestation, and maintains the conspiracy of silence that allows the fiction to continue. This knowledge creates a strange intimacy between mistress and servant, bound together by shared secrets that could destroy both their positions if revealed. The maid's discretion becomes essential to the lady's survival, while the lady's continued employment provides the maid's livelihood. They are co-conspirators in maintaining an elaborate lie that everyone knows is false, but no one dares acknowledge. The psychological toll of this constant performance cannot be overstated. Women develop elaborate coping mechanisms, the discreet use of scratching implements, the careful timing of private moments when they can briefly acknowledge their discomfort, the mental compartmentalization that allows them to function despite constant physical distress. They become actresses in their own lives, performing the role of the perfect lady while secretly enduring conditions that would be considered torture in any other context. As we approach the final chapter of this investigation, we must confront the ultimate question. What does this tell us about the nature of social control, the price of perfection, and the lengths to which human beings will go to maintain acceptance in their communities? The infested wig becomes a metaphor for something much larger: the gap between appearance and reality, the cost of conformity, and the ways in which societies can convince individuals to participate in their own suffering. Chapter 5. The Philosophy of Suffering: What the Bugs Reveal About Humanity. As we reach the end of our journey through the crawling reality of Victorian beauty, we must step back and examine what this grotesque chapter of history reveals about human nature, social control, and the price we pay. For acceptance, the infested hairpiece is more than a historical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting fundamental truths about how societies function and how individuals respond to collective pressure. The Victorian wig represents the ultimate triumph of appearance over reality, of social performance over individual well-being. These women were not simply victims of fashion, they were participants in a complex system that required the suppression of biological truth in service of social fiction. They chose to endure crawling scalps, toxic treatments, and constant discomfort rather than risk the social death that would follow exposure as unclean. This choice reveals something profound about the nature of social control. The most effective forms of oppression are those that convince the oppressed to participate willingly, to police themselves, to choose suffering over rebellion. The Victorian lady did not need guards or chains, she needed only the fear of social rejection, the threat of being revealed as fundamentally human in a world that demanded she appear angelic. The conspiracy of silence that surrounded these infestations demonstrates how entire communities can collaborate in maintaining harmful fictions. Everyone knew the ladies themselves, their servants, their doctors, their families, yet no one spoke. The knowledge was shared but unacknowledged, creating a collective delusion that served no one's interests while causing widespread suffering. The economic dimensions of this story reveal how suffering becomes commodified, how desperation is harvested and transformed into luxury goods for those who can afford them. The hair trade that supplied Victorian wigs was built on the exploitation of the poor, the sick, and the dead. The wealthy literally wore the biological remnants of poverty on their heads, transforming human misery into symbols of status and refinement. The medical response to these infestations, the dismissal of women's complaints as hysteria, the prescription of toxic treatments that caused more harm than the original problem, demonstrates how institutions can become complicit in maintaining harmful systems. Doctors who should have been advocates for their patients' health instead became enforcers of social norms, pathologizing resistance to an inherently pathological situation. But perhaps most disturbing is what this story reveals about the capacity for self-deception. These women were not ignorant of their condition. They felt the crawling, smelled the decay, experienced the constant discomfort. Yet they learned to reinterpret their own sensations, to dismiss the evidence of their senses when it conflicted with social necessity. They became experts in gaslighting themselves, in choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The archetype of the Victorian lady, sitting perfectly still in her drawing room while insects crawl across her scalp, becomes a powerful metaphor for the human capacity to endure the unendurable when the alternative seems worse. She represents all of us when we choose conformity over comfort, appearance over authenticity, social acceptance over individual well-being. The eventual decline of these fashions came not from medical enlightenment or feminist rebellion, but from changing social conditions that made the performance less necessary. As women gained more economic independence and social mobility, as ideas about natural beauty began to challenge artificial enhancement, as the costs of maintaining these elaborate constructions became harder to justify, the system gradually collapsed under its own contradictions. But the underlying dynamics persist in different forms. We still live in a world where appearance matters more than reality, where individuals sacrifice their health and comfort for social acceptance, where entire industries profit from convincing people that their natural state is inadequate. The specific practices may change, but the fundamental human susceptibilities remain constant. The modern beauty industry, worth hundreds of billions of dollars globally, operates on the same principles that drove Victorian women to wear infested wigs. It convinces people that their natural appearance is insufficient, that they must purchase products and services to achieve social acceptance, that the discomfort and expense are justified by the results. Hair extensions, Cosmetic surgery, extreme dieting, chemical treatments all carry risks and discomfort that people willingly accept in pursuit of an idealized image. Social media has created new forms of the Victorian drawing room, spaces where appearance must be carefully curated and any evidence of biological reality carefully hidden. The gap between the perfect online persona and the messy reality of actual life echoes the gap between the polished Victorian facade and the crawling truth beneath. The psychological mechanisms remain the same as well. People learn to dismiss their own discomfort, to reinterpret their experiences to align with social expectations, to participate in collective fictions that serve no one's real interests. The lady's maid has been replaced by beauty influencers and cosmetic surgeons, but the role remains the same: to maintain the conspiracy of silence that keeps the system functioning. As we look back at those sepia photographs of stern-faced Victorian women with their impossible hairstyles, we should see not quaint historical curiosities, but warnings about the price of perfection, the danger of prioritizing appearance over reality, the human capacity for self-deception in service of social acceptance. The real question is not why they wore infested wigs, it is why it took so long for them to stop. What had to change in society, in economics, in ideas about identity and authenticity, before people could finally set down their burdens and appear in public as themselves? And what burdens are we still carrying? What performances are we still maintaining that we might someday have the courage to abandon? The Victorian wig, crawling with lice and heavy with the weight of social expectation, was more than a fashion accessory. It was a physical embodiment of the price people pay for acceptance, the discomfort they endure for belonging, the reality they hide beneath elaborate artifice. In understanding why people wore these infested constructions, we understand something fundamental about human nature and social dynamics that remains painfully relevant today. We are still performing, still constructing personas, still enduring discomfort for acceptance. We have simply become more sophisticated at hiding the lice. So I ask you now, if you had lived in that world, would you have preferred to keep the illusion, the beautiful wig, the perfect etiquette, knowing what crawled beneath it? Or would you have risked your reputation to speak the uncomfortable truth? And more importantly, what uncomfortable truths are we avoiding today? What are we enduring now that future generations will find equally absurd and incomprehensible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the modern equivalents you see, the ways we still sacrifice comfort for conformity, reality for appearance. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden, uncomfortable, and deeply human stories behind history's most polished surfaces, subscribe and join us as we continue peeling back the beautiful lies to find the crawling truths underneath. The past is never as clean as it appears in the history books, and neither, perhaps, is the present.